Hi friends, my name's Chris, and for today's book club we'll be talking about Pascal's Pensées, sections 7 to 10, covering morality, why moral frameworks break down, original sin, the nature of God, paradoxes of the human condition, and other adjacent topics. If you guys like philosophy or theology, then I hope you guys enjoyed the little talk. Sweet, yeah, so this is the fourth book club on Pascal's Pensées. And so far, the way this book has been organized, at least in the PDF version that we're reading, it's been organized in terms of first Pascal trying to make sense of humans, of our condition, of our paradoxes, of our contradictions. Um, and now it's starting to move a little bit more into Christian doctrine and why Christian doctrine can help explain and solve a lot of the paradoxes and issues that come with understanding why we are the way we are. We talked a lot about the his autobiography, so his life, his big night of fire, his interactions with the Jansenists, his proto psychology, and then the way he understood people to think. And now we're getting more and more into human nature, the paradoxes of human nature, and why Christianity can help explain these paradoxes of human nature, or why Pascal thinks that Christianity can explain these paradoxes in human nature. And so we're going to be covering sections 7 to 10 from the PDF. And the first section that we'll talk about briefly is about morality and doctrine. And so morality is this term that gets flung around, and a lot of people ground it in different things, right? So a lot of people think that, or will say that, oh, what is moral is what it says on the law on a piece of paper. What is moral is what my parents told me. What is moral is what the social norms allow. Pascal doesn't think that these are adequate views of morality. He thinks that that's a very brittle way of understanding morality. And to understand true morality, we need Christian doctrine, or we need something a little bit more metaphysical, a little more grounded and sound than these human concepts or human created concepts. He thinks that very, very often our moral frameworks, our ways of kind of building our senses of what's right and wrong, whether it's through legal practice or social norms, they they fail because they're not completely understanding what it means to be human. The utilitarians are trying to derive moral righteousness from calculations and from reasons, and hedonists are trying to do so on the basis of what makes it pleasurable. And all of these different philosophies or frameworks of morality, they're missing a key component, and that is that we are inherently these paradoxical beings, and we're diagnosed with this human condition. We are great, and at the very same time we are terrible. And so um, Pascal's trying to think his way through, what's the solution here then. He jests a little bit at he wags his finger a little bit at the Stoics, saying that they exaggerate human dignity far too much. They think um, that human dignity and autonomy, temperance and justice, these things are completely within us and all up to us. He also points his finger a little bit at the skeptics in saying that, well, they're just kind of dramatic and emphasizing how miserable we might be sometimes. Um, and so he's kind of noting down in this section that, well, what we really need is Christianity, because Christianity can perfectly understand both extremes and the paradox as a whole of what it means to have this human condition. And then so one way of explaining away these paradoxes is through original sin. And so we know that Pascal was a Jansenist, and the Jansenists, they absolutely loved Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo. And they had this belief or this understanding that changed. This wasn't always the belief in the Christian church of original sin. And essentially what original sin is the idea that we are born innately sinful. The second we pop out of the womb, we are evil. Or we are kind of like filled up with this sin. And so this led to a lot of things. One of the more notable or obvious things is that babies now, they get baptized once they're born or really really early on in life. Why? Because Augustine believed and argued that since we were born in sin, we needed to cleanse ourselves of these sins the second that was possible. Uh, Before this, there was this idea that maybe humans weren't born completely in sin, but we accumulated sin as we grew up and as we got older, and so a lot of people would have their baptisms later on in life, and so Pascal's kind of thinking, well, original sin, this is a really good way of explaining away this paradox, explaining away this human condition of how we can be so wretched, evil, and disgusting at sometimes, but then also so great, brilliant, and pious at other times. Well, it's because we are born with this wretchedness, but within us there are still traces of greatness and of divinity. And so long as we accept the grace of God, um, we can kind of like guide moral systems, so that they don't collapse in on themselves, either to complete pride or to complete despair, to the extremes of the human condition. And so original sin is kind of his answer to how we can solve or understand these paradoxes of the human condition. He also discusses the fall a little bit, or the fall of Adam. This is the story that most people know or understand of when he kind of like bit the apple or disobeyed God. And he's also taking this from Augustine. He kind of is arguing here that, well, the doctrine of the fall, it was a damage to human nature itself. Um, because of this, not only did humans inherit guilt from Adam, we also inherited original sin. That's kind of where it came from. That's why we're all born in sin. Um, and attached with that, we have this corrupted will, and this corrupted will on its own will never be enough to establish sound moral frameworks that we need. Because remember, he's trying to figure out how we can have strong, non-brittle moral frameworks that seem to be failing time and time again in his life and in his world. And so he kind of goes to reason then that, well, after the fall, humans cannot fully choose good without divine grace. Since we're corrupted a little bit, we need a little bit of help, and that help is the divine grace that's bestowed unto us thanks to God. In section 8, he starts to talk a little bit about like the tenets or the foundations for Christian religion, and how these foundations in Christian religion, along with things like original sin, can explain away the paradoxes and the contradictions that seem so challenging for people, about the human condition. And so, well, one that we just talked about was original sin. Through original sin, we can understand that we can be both great at one moment and wretched at the same moment. And he thinks that just understanding enough, just knowing enough, that is not enough entirely to understand Christianity and God's grace. We need revelation. And so he goes one step further a little bit here, and he says, well, we are very paradoxical. At least this is how I'm understanding it. We're terribly paradoxical. Um, we don't understand ourselves. We do things that are very hard to explain. And so attempting to understand ourselves through reason alone, that's not going to satisfy it. Therefore, Christianity, a doctrine based both that encompasses both reason and faith, it can encapsulate and explain away the human condition in a way that no other philosophies can. And that's kind of, I think that's his main push or that's the argument he's trying to make or make clear to us in these sections. That to be a Christian is not irrational, it's actually extra rational. It's like super rational in a type of way. And then he continues and talks a little bit about kind of like the nature of God and what types of proofs God can provide. And one of these is, the revelation or the embodiment of Christ. That's kind of like, boom, proof that God is real and that the Christian doctrine is a legit thing. Because we had Christ who suffered and showed mercy and communicated and taught us a lot of things. Other arguments for the existence and proof of God, though, philosophical arguments, namely, one that comes to mind is his own wager in section 3 of this book. He says that these types of arguments or proofs for God, they're good. They might point to a creator, suggest a creator, entice us from like a reasoning point of view, but without understanding what being a Christian is or Christian revelation, then these are kind of like empty arguments. They're a bit hollow. Pascal's wager is a bit hollow if we're not understanding what it means to actually live like a Christian, to actually understand revelation and all that type of stuff. And so that's what he's pushing here in section 8. And then one more thing he talks about the nature of God, or he discusses, which I think is really, really interesting and would be probably a good point of discussion, would be the seemingly paradoxical nature of God. Right? So in many instances in the Bible, he says that God reveals himself, or it says that God reveals himself in one way or another. He himself feels like he was exposed to God during his night of fire. How come at the same time then, God always seems to be a little bit hidden? Like, I can't see him in this room. I can't, if I go into the forest or look up at the stars, I don't see him, but sometimes he does reveal himself. Why is he doing this like 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the door type thing? Well, Pascal thinks that he doesn't scream out and announce his existence. He doesn't just like pop embodied in front of your face to prove himself, because that's not how we should go about believing in God. We shouldn't believe in God just because we can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear him right in front of us. The reason we should believe in God is because of a humility and understanding that we don't know everything. A desire to accept grace, maybe. A desire for salvation probably would be the best answer. And so being Christian is a lot more than just accepting propositions. It's living your life in a way where you have a constant relationship and desire for salvation. At least this is how I'm understanding him in these sections. Then he talks a little bit about perpetuity, and this is, I think, this is where this book gets a little bit weaker for me, and where it just like the strength of his arguments, they kind of falter a tiny bit. So he starts to kind of look at, he's writing this apology for Christianity, and he starts to use evidence of historical accounts to bolster the legitimacy of Christian doctrine. And so he starts to say, well, Christianity is an extremely old religion. It dates back to the Jews. And these Jews had scriptures who are the oldest known to man. He's contending here that since they are so ancient, these scriptures, and since Christianity derived itself from Judaism, that these are grounds to legitimize the Christian doctrine over other doctrines. He also kind of speaks a little bit to Chinese religions at the time, or pagan religions, without, I feel like he doesn't do them justice or doesn't even understand them very well, but he's saying that they don't meet the bar. Christianity does a lot better of a job at explaining the paradoxes of the human condition than all these other religions. They are very dubious, very suppressed, non-continuous. They're not as old as Judaism and Christianity. And it seems weird because if his argument was that the older the religion, the better, Christianity at that point was only, what, 1,600 years old? It's like, that's not the longest. Anyways, so he attaches Judaism to Christianity there in hopes of bolstering this claim. He thinks that one hallmark of a true religion is that it survives persecution. And as you know, the Jews have been persecuted since their inception, basically, time and time again. And so he thinks that because of that, there's more legitimacy to the Christian doctrine over other doctrines. And so that's the historical account that he's trying to make, a type of like a type of historical apology or evidence he's trying to kind of muster up. The last one, the section 10, which I didn't completely understand why he was talking about what he was talking about. He was saying that there was a lot of instances in older scriptures, either in the Torah or in the Old Testament, of events that foreshadowed the realities and the arrival of Christ. And because there was a lot of foreshadowing, which he doesn't give any very clear examples, but because of all of this foreshadowing in the Old Testament, then once again that legitimizes the Christian doctrine even more. He he argues that God chose the Israelites as the custodians for this type of revelation, so that the prophecies about Jesus or the Messiah could be entrusted to a community with such a long-standing tradition. And that doesn't, like, I mean, I guess, but there's not much. Personally, I didn't find much weight or appeal to the typology of looking. He kind of says, like, oh, we need to look at the scriptures in the Bible as in a spiritual sense, a non-literal sense, yet religious sense. He's losing me at this point, and maybe I'm just not understanding because I'm not a Christian. But yeah, that's all I had, more or less, slides wise, because I haven't been putting a lot of time into book club. But oh well, that is that. I'll go ahead. Yeah, there you go. I'll wrap that up.